September 11, 2001, 8:46 in the morning. Hundreds of thousands of people around the world watching the same scene witnessed two passenger planes fly into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, the symbol of New York's economic power. The result was 3,000 dead. This attack, which triggered a series of events that are still going on in the Middle East, contains many secrets that have still not yet been resolved. The September 11th attacks are one of the portents of the end times, revealed by our Prophet, peace be upon him, in the Hadiths 1,400 years ago. The attack, which initiated a chain of events that had a profound impact on the planet and the Islamic world, was a metaphysical event, and a number of secrets behind it have still not yet been resolved. Official statements based on investigations in the wake of these events that cost the lives of approximately 3,000 people contain many deficiencies and inconsistencies. Let us look at these one by one. The first plane to hit the World Trade Center was said to be a Boeing 767. These are made out of aluminum, and no matter how great the speed of impact, an aluminum body can never slice through a steel construction like a knife through butter. That is a violation of physical and metallurgical laws. But one of the two planes did slice through the building like a razor blade, emerging from the other side of the tower with its wings still intact. But images obtained from plane crashes and tests carried out to date show that even a plane hitting a forested area from low altitude would lose its wings when it hit the trees. Let us recall Japanese planes known as kamikazes that dived down onto American warships during the Second World War. These planes that struck the ships at full speed never managed to slice through the whole ship. They only managed to damage the planes on the top deck. The South Tower completely collapsed in about 10 seconds, approximately 1 hour after being hit. 29 minutes after that, the North Tower collapsed, also in about 10 seconds. The official explanation for the collapse is that the fuel stores and the kitchens caught fire in the blaze that began at the impact zone, and the resulting conflagration damaged the building's load-bearing columns. No similar event has ever been recorded in the world before. 3 buildings have collapsed because of fire, but steel construction was not used in any of them. A plane struck the 79th floor of the Empire State Building on July 28, 1945, but only that floor and the surrounding area was damaged. The building remains sound and is still in use to this day. Huge fires have broken out in many skyscrapers up until our day, but none of these have collapsed. Could the building's steel columns have been shattered by the explosion of jet fuel or fuel tanks? The buildings were built out of steel that is fire resistant. Even non-fire resistant steel only begins to melt at 1,648 degrees Celsius. Even if kerosene, the jet fuel, burns constantly for 40 minutes, it will still only reach a maximum temperature of 1,120 degrees Celsius. Yet much of the fuel would explode and vaporize at the moment of impact, and thus it is scientifically impossible for it to become hot enough to melt steel during the impact and explosion. If the building's resistance had been weakened, as claimed, then rather than collapsing where it stood, the building would be expected to break in the middle and collapse sideways onto buildings standing around. Yet the building collapsed like one specially designed to fall down where it stood. Would installing a bomb on every floor be sufficient to bring these buildings down? An explosive substance known as thermite is used in controlled demolitions. This is enough to reach the melting point of steel columns. In controlled demolitions using explosives, building steel columns are broken at specific points, and the building collapses in the designed direction. But as can be seen from the pictures of the collapse of the Twin Towers, the buildings turn to dust instantaneously. This white dust given off in the wake of the collapse is not a phenomenon encountered in the collapse of other major buildings or in fires. That dust is the remains of pulverization of the building's steel and concrete elements. In other words, they're being turned into particles of 100 microns or less in size. 434 tons of concrete were used for each floor of the World Trade Center. Neither being hit by a plane nor a localized explosion or fire would be enough to pulverize that much concrete into tiny bits less than 1 millimeter in size. This white dust that covered the city in the wake of the collapse of the towers is reminiscent of an event described as a corruption of dust and smoke in the Hadith of our Prophet, peace be upon him. The thermite used as an explosive material in demolition work is enough to cause melting point in steel columns, but not to pulverize them. The resistance of the World Trade Center steel construction made it one of the world's very few such buildings. The central load-bearing and external columns all consisted of 12.7 centimeter thick steel. This construction feature is 3 times thicker than that used in Russian T-34 tanks, the most powerfully armored tanks of the World War II, and would make it impossible for the buildings to be demolished using explosives. We can consider an example for comparative purposes. No explosive could entirely destroy a T-34 tank's armor. At the most, it could open a small hole in it, but the steel construction used in these buildings was 3 times stronger than T-34 tanks. In other words, it is absolutely impossible for these buildings to collapse, even using explosives. But how did such sound structures simply turn into dust? The World Trade Center was a building that would not collapse using generally employed techniques, and, according to US building regulations, it is forbidden to build a skyscraper that cannot be demolished. That is why when construction begins, demolition plans also have to be provided. The World Trade Center demolition project contains a thermonuclear demolition point 77 meters beneath the foundations, as with many other skyscrapers erected since the 1970s. The Soviet Special Control Service, codename Military Unit Number 46179, monitored the use of nuclear material permitted under the Friendly Nuclear Energy Use Agreement with America in the 1970s. The unit has a file called Emergency Demolition Plan designed for the World Trade Center. In this technique, the shock waves or electromagnetic waves familiar to us in nuclear explosions do not happen. Therefore, they cannot be identified by the communications equipment around. Only a destructive thermal shock wave rising along the steel structure of the building can cause a building to be pulverized instantaneously. If a nuclear explosive were used, would the destructive effects of that not spread over the entire city? When nuclear explosives are mentioned, most of us think of an image of a whole city being destroyed, such as Hiroshima or Nagasaki. That is true when nuclear explosives make contact with the air. This is known as an atmospheric nuclear explosion, or airburst. But if the nuclear explosive is placed inside a rock stratum, this is called an underground nuclear explosion, and the resulting picture is very different. In an atmospheric nuclear explosion, 99% of the energy is spread around as X-rays. Since these rays will be absorbed by the atoms in the atmosphere, they cannot spread very far and remain within a small radius. The extremely hot nuclear hypocenter spreads thermal radiation all around. Thermal radiation can travel a long distance. In a nuclear explosion, one of the destructive forces that can cause people and buildings to burn up is thermal radiation. The second demolishing force is a destructive shock wave. That shock wave travels at the speed of sound and destroys anything in its path like a huge wall. Potentially lethal ionized radiation is then emitted that would eventually cause people to die of radiation sickness. In an underground nuclear explosion, on the other hand, neither thermal radiation nor a destructive shockwave is given off, because air is needed for these effects to be manifested. An explosive located underground will not come into contact with the air, so 99% of the energy will be emitted as X-rays, and the rock, for instance granite, in the vicinity will be entirely evaporated in a spherical shell. But the heat and pressure will rise to such an extent that the surrounding areas are not only evaporated, but also assumes a plasma form and starts applying intense pressure to rock close by. In the wake of that pressure, the plasma-filled interior part produces an expansion in the surrounding rock, and this expanding part is completely pulverized in a matter of seconds. If the pulverized part is arranged so as to correspond with the foundation of a building, the building will also be pulverized in seconds. The distinguishing characteristic of pulverized material is that it maintains the same form and color. However, when pressure is applied to it, it dissipates in the forms of tiny particles, 100 microns or less in size. This image shows the area around a nuclear bomb detonated underground. Since the bomb was detonated close to ground level, a part of the ground has been pulverized, but there is no change in the ground's appearance. The vegetation cover even still maintains its green appearance, but eventually the whole region is seen to turn to dust and fall apart. The amount of nuclear material used in the World Trade Center was enough to pulverize 300 meters of the building, but the building was 400 meters high. And since this region will put pressure on the pulverized area, it seemed to be suspended in the air for many seconds and then collapsed, most of it turning to dust. That is the reason for the white dust that covered the city, and that is the sole reason why melted steel was extracted from the ruins 3 months later. One of the most important pieces of evidence for the likelihood that a nuclear system was used to demolish the building is the unexplained speed at which it collapsed. According to the laws of physics, an object will freefall at a specific speed. According to that calculation, an object dropped from the height of the World Trade Center will fall to Earth in 9.2 seconds. As seismic records and video images show, the building collapsed in about 10 seconds. You can think of it this way. If you dropped a basketball from the building's roof at the moment it started to collapse, that is how long it would take the ball to reach the Earth. Even if the buildings were demolished by exploding a bomb, if the floors that collapsed on top of one another resisted for as little as a quarter of a second, it still would have taken the building 50 seconds to collapse. But it actually collapsed as fast as if it had been dropped from the air. And this is important evidence to support the claim of thermonuclear destruction from beneath the building. If such a huge crater were opened up in the granite bed on which the building stood, it would have been there when the wreckage was removed. As can be seen from these images, huge cavities appeared on the granite foundation under the building. The granite itself had melted and disappeared. It is impossible for such melting to take place under the foundation of a building demolished by weakening it with fire. Such melting and cavities have never been encountered in the underlying foundations of a building demolished using explosives either. This picture shows how close the towers that collapsed were to other buildings around. If a classic controlled demolition technique using explosives had been employed, then some damage would have been caused to surrounding buildings, albeit only minor. If the buildings had collapsed due to fire, as claimed, then that damage would have reached great dimensions. But since the collapsing towers turned to dust while still falling, and much of the wreckage filled the hole in the rock on which they were standing, the surrounding buildings were not damaged at all. You have seen here the towers were pulverized while they were still standing, and only then collapsed. What you are seeing on the screen is the building's steel antenna, but instead of being turned to dust, it is waving in the air. All this scientific evidence shows that the Twin Towers were demolished using a nuclear explosive. As for the people alleged to have hijacked the planes, the press have long been reporting that 9 of the 11 are still at work and living in different countries. All these scientific data show that the Twin Towers were demolished in a nuclear demolition. As we have seen, the events on September 11th conflict with the official explanations and contain many metaphysical secrets. The way that this matches a report given by our Prophet, peace be upon him, 1,400 years ago, is without doubt one of the miracles of our Prophet, peace be upon him.